As soon as Enemy at the Gates was first released, it attracted a lot of attention from historians and military history enthusiasts, but for all the wrong reasons. Critics have been berating it for decades for its, at times, offensive representation of Soviet troops during the Battle of Stalingrad, and outright lies it said about the men and women who fought in one of the largest battles in human history. The movie still did fairly well, making $97 million on a $68 million budget and reinforcing Jude Law as one of Hollywood's biggest stars. It managed to do this because of the facade of historical accuracy. At first glance, the firearms, the uniforms, the locations, the dates, they're all correct. But once you pause a few frames and take a better look, and once you take a bit of a deeper dive into historic breakdowns of those events, you'll start noticing that a lot of things said and done in this movie are just laughably incorrect. Today, we're traveling through time to the Battle of Stalingrad, or at least to the version of the battle that this movie would have you believe. Enemy at the Gates is full to the brim with World War II era firearms. 18 different firearms appear in the movie alongside a bunch of tanks, mortars, anti-air guns, and howitzers, completing a fairly rich orchestra of era-accurate guns. We won't analyze every single weapon scene in the movie. If we did, the video would be an hour long, so we'll instead focus on the thematically most important and most iconic weapons. Also, there are a lot of historically inaccurate things depicted in this movie. We'll talk about them a bit later. For now, let's just stick to pure firearm accuracy. The very first rifle we see in the movie is the Mosin-Nagant M9130. This is also the first mistake in the movie because the scene takes place a few decades before the gun even existed. But trust me, bigger mistakes are coming. This is not only one of the most mass-produced rifles in history, it's one of the most mass-produced firearms of any kind. The various variants of the Mosin-Nagant, ones that have served the Russian kingdom and the USSR before the model M9130, have been in service since 1891. The M9130 model is the redesign of the original Mosin-Nagant, and as the name implies, it entered service in 1930. It was by far the most common firearm used by the largest mobilized army in history during the Second World War. The variant used by Vasily Zaitsev in the movie is 48.5 inches long with a 29-inch barrel, weighing in at 8.8 pounds. The bolt-action rifle fires 7.62 by 54mm rounds, which come in 5-round clips, and it's effective to about half a click without optics. The optics are one of the few things that made the difference between a regular Mosin-Nagant rifle and a sniper variant. The first MN sniper rifles used a PE scope, which is a Soviet copy of, ironically, German design, but later rifles used the Soviet-produced PU scope. In real life, Vasily used the PE scope in Stalingrad, not the PU scope. Remember this, it's going to be important later. To accommodate for the scopes, whether it's the PU or PE, gunsmiths had to replace bolt handles on the rifles. Since the scope is mounted above the chamber, snipers needed a longer bolt handle to chamber the next round without the scope interfering. You can see this longer handle on this historic picture of Zaitsev. Gun and history advisors on the set of the movie paid attention to this because this is the first Mosin-Nagant we get a close-up of in the movie. You can clearly see that there's no scope and the bolt handle is short and straight, while this is the sniper variant with a bent bolt handle. Now, did you remember what was said about Zaitsev only using the PE scope in Stalingrad? Well, the only glaring fault surrounding the Mosin-Nagant in this movie is the PU scope, which we can see used by every sniper including Vasily himself. The PU didn't roll off the production line until the fall of 1942, which is when this movie takes place. Very few, if any, soldiers in Stalingrad actually had the PU scope, and if they did receive it, they got it towards the end of the battle in 1943. Certainly not the very day the scopes were produced. Although it is possible that Zaitsev got his hands on one eventually, maybe after the battle, he most likely only used the old PE scope during this time in Stalingrad. We actually have a lot of photos to prove that as well. Now, Zaitsev's Mosin-Nagant is allegedly kept in a Battle of Stalingrad museum in Volgograd. As we can see, it has the PU scope, and if this really is Vasily's real rifle, which is a fair point to raise because the USSR and propaganda went hand in hand like Diddy and Epstein, that means he got the PU scope at some point after the battle. However, all of the materials created during the battle depict him with the PE scope. Another positive detail worth pointing out is the accuracy of the reticle. Whenever the movie cuts to the shooter's POV, whether it's Zaitsev or Kulikov, what we see really is the PE scope reticle. It often happens in movies that we get random reticles inserted into what should be a historically accurate scope, but what we see here is the real deal. The Mosin-Nagant production line closed for good in 1973, but this gun is so widespread and with so many units produced, it's only natural that it's still in service today. Mostly, but not exclusively, in countries with a tight budget. It was, through history, used by some massive military forces other than the USSR, such as the United States, China, France, Turkey, Nazi Germany, and others. On the other side of the coin, we have the Kar98k, otherwise simply known as the Kar98k or K98k, which was Germany's standard service rifle at the time. This rifle is used by Major Koenig, the German sniper sent to hunt down Vasily Zaitsev. In the beginning of the war, German high command didn't see a need for sniper rifles with telescopic sights because they believed that their superior tactics would outweigh the enemy snipers. But they quickly saw that they had underestimated the value of snipers. K98k rifles were chosen as the go-to sniper weapon while Germany was still fighting in Poland, and the rifles were quickly equipped with Zeiss ZF39 scopes and issued to snipers. K98Ks were chosen for this role specifically because of their accuracy in the testing phase. The 23.62-inch barrel did wonders at the time, and soldiers described the gun as extremely accurate up to 400 meters even without the use of a scope. With the German telescopic sights, it's accurate up to about 800 meters, although that depends on the operator, but it can suppress targets that are up to a kilometer away. The entire gun is 43.7 inches long and weighs between 8 and 9 pounds, depending on the variant. The carbine fires 792 by 57mm Mauser rounds, which was one of the most popular cartridges in the entire world at the time. Now, the issue with the K98k in this movie is identical to the Mosin-Nagant issue. They're using the wrong scope. Major Koenig uses a ZF42 scope, which is a scope that only entered the testing phase in the spring of 1943, by which point German soldiers were returning from Stalingrad with tails tucked between their legs. It would be impossible for Koenig to have that scope as it literally didn't exist at the time, and it's likely he'd use a ZF39. He probably wouldn't use the ZF41, which did exist at the time, for a plethora of reasons that we won't go into here, but they ultimately add up to the fact that the thing sucks. Fun fact, the ZF42 was developed alongside the ZFG42, a German scope clearly influenced by the Soviet PU scope. Moving on. Aside from the fact that the scope shouldn't exist, its reticle is also wrong. This is what the reticle on a ZF39 and a ZF42 scope really looks like, almost identical to the Soviet PEM reticle. However, it's possible that the mistake was intentional. Maybe the director didn't want the audience mistaking one sniper for another in the intense sniper battle scenes, so we had to differentiate their POVs somehow. It's now only apt to point out something that we don't get to see in the movie, but it really did happen and it's very scope specific, and that is the use of the Soviet PE scope on K98Ks. It would actually be more realistic if the movie advisors put a PE scope on Koenig's rifle. Some German soldiers managed to turn their K98Ks into sniper variants by taking the scopes off their dead enemies' Mosin-Nagants and attaching them to their carbines in the field. This was incredibly difficult as it was widely known at the time that you need an armorer to attach a Zeiss scope, a scope specifically designed for K98Ks, mind you, because the receiver did not leave much room for the operation of the bolt handle if you attached the scope too close to it. This is also the reason why most scopes on K98Ks sit so high up. So, just the fact that armorers were attaching enemy scopes to turn run-of-the-mill K98Ks into sniper rifles in the field is mind-blowing. Obviously, we're going to deduct points for these very niche mistakes, but the Kar98k and Mosin-Nagant aren't the only firearms in the movie, even if they are the most important ones. The Tokarev TT-33 makes an appearance too, both the pre-1947 and the post-1947 version. You can tell the difference by looking at the serrations on the top of the gun. At one point in the movie, we get to see an officer firing the post-1947 model, which is impossible because the Battle of Stalingrad started in 1942 and ended in 1943. Another iconic weapon is the PPSH-41. Although we only get to see it in one scene in the movie, the drum magazine is instantly recognizable. This submachine gun was developed in 1941 and more than left its mark on the Second World War. More than 6 million pieces were produced and issued to the Red Army. With a fire rate of 1,250 RPM, the PPSH had one of the highest rates of fire of the entire war. It was designed to use the same rounds as the Tokarev pistol, the standardized 7.62 by 25mm cartridges, which we see loaded in 71 round drums in the movie. The biggest drawback of this fantastic weapon is its weight, coming in at around 12 pounds with a full drum. It's definitely not something you want to be dragging around all day. Although there are much better submachine guns out there on the market today, the PPSH is still in use by some militaries around the world, including North Korea. It was in fact also used by German soldiers during the Second World War. We also catch a glance of the PM M191030, which is the Russian and later Soviet adaptation of the iconic Maxim gun, the world's first fully automatic machine gun. It was adopted in 1910, but the version we see in the movie is the modernized version introduced in 1930. With the wheeled mount we see in the movie, the entire weapon system weighs close to 140 pounds, firing close to 600 7.62x52mm rounds per minute. One thing you'll notice about the machine gun is the snow cap, also known as the tractor cap on top. That's this little thing here. The snow cap is an opening in the water jacket that allows soldiers to put snow in the jacket, which would melt and cool the weapon down. The Soviets officially adopted this in 1943 after the Battle of Stalingrad, which is why some people argue that this machine gun shouldn't look like that. However, historians say that some Maxims adopted the modifications as early as 1941, after the Winter War with Finland and well before the beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad. They only started mass-producing Maxims with the cap in 1943 though, but it's nevertheless possible that the gun we see in the movie is one of the few pre-1943 snow cap guns. Although not a firearm, we also see a destroyed T-34-85 tank in the streets of Stalingrad, which is anachronistic because the first variants of the 85 were produced in 1944, long after the battle had ended. We see fewer German guns as the movie largely revolves around Soviet troops, but we do get to see MP-38, MP-40, and MP-41. What really takes the cake though is the appearance of the MG-42. Although the iconic machine gun did see some action in Stalingrad, the variant in the battle has the vertical charging handle, which was only introduced after the battle. The Germans' experience in the Eastern Front's freezing cold was one of the main reasons they switched from a horizontal to a vertical charging handle. The horizontal handle was, according to the operators, very hard to pull back, and the entire process was only made more difficult by the extreme cold. Aside from the few minor inconsistencies pointed out, and these really are minor, as they don't take anything away from the experience and immersion, the weapons used in Enemy at the Gates are true to the era they're representing. The only serious mistakes are the wrong scopes used for both sniper rifles. However, if you thought that was shaky, wait until you get a closer look at the historic realism. This movie walks a very thin line when it comes to realism, and it's been getting battered left, right, and center by historians ever since it was released. Enemy at the Gates is actually based on a non-fiction book called Enemy at the Gates: The Battle for Stalingrad. The movie doesn't follow the book to the T, but it most definitely commits the same sins, as the book was also berated by everyone for its exaggerated and outright untrue depiction of the battle. Vasily Zaitsev wrote his own account of his military career in a book called There Was No Land for Us Beyond the Volga, Sniper's Notes, but that book was not taken into account when writing the script for this movie. The vast majority of criticism pertains to tidbits of military history depicted in the movie, so let's take a look at the herd of elephants in the room and see what checks out and what doesn't. Starting off with the intro, that's actually one of the most realistic scenes in the movie. Zaitsev grew up in the Ural Mountains where his grandfather taught him how to shoot. Together, they hunted deer and wolves, although he killed his first wolf with a shotgun, not a Mosin-Nagant, but that's neither here nor there. It's also impossible to ignore the tangent between Zaitsev and the legendary Finnish sniper Simo Hauha. The greatest sniper of all time, as a lot of enthusiasts call him, made his name in the Winter War, which is ironic because Zaitsev was serving in the Pacific Fleet at the time, which would make him and Hauha enemies. Hauha allegedly killed around 500 Soviet soldiers, while Zaitsev allegedly had more than 400 kills, with around 225 of those being in Stalingrad. But what makes Zaitsev similar to him are the tactics. First of all, Hauha also used a Mosin-Nagant, admittedly a Finnish variant, but a Mosin-Nagant nonetheless. Neither of them had any formal training. Their qualities as a sniper were partly pure talent and partly came from life experience. In fact, very few snipers at the time had any formal training because the only militaries with sniper schools were the Wehrmacht and the British Army, with the Soviets later establishing a women's sniper training school. Hauha would also put snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from giving away his position. The final similarity between the two is the fact that both suffered a wound to the face but ultimately survived the wars they took part in. We'll now stop talking about Hauha, but I'll let that topic go by mentioning that as of 2025, a movie about him is officially in the works. The two big questions that are often posed by people who watch this movie for the first time are, how come the Red Army had so many women on the front, and how come they had so many snipers? Both are very valid questions, and the depiction of women in the movie is actually quite realistic. If anything, there aren't enough women in the movie. The Red Army was the only military force that accepted women in combat roles. At the time, most other countries accepted women into administrative, medical, and auxiliary roles, but the Red Army accepted women pilots, snipers, machine gunners, and regular infantrymen, or should we say infantry women. Throughout the course of the war, more than 800,000 women would serve in the Red Army, which was roughly 5% of the entire force, with nearly 200,000 receiving some sort of decoration. Therefore, it's not odd at all to see Tanya Chernova, who was a real person by the way, but more on that later, serving alongside Zaitsev. As for the seemingly never-ending sniper force in the Red Army, what a lot of people fail to realize is just how massive the Red Army was. More than 37 million people rotated for the USSR's army during the war, and it's not surprising at all to find that a few of them were naturally good marksmen. Also, we have to keep in mind that the USSR was a huge country, and millions of Soviets lived in very isolated communities. Some of them learned how to shoot and hunt before starting elementary school, with Vasily Zaitsev being one of those kids, which would only reinforce their marksmanship skills during the war. The Central Women's Sniper Training School would be established in the spring of 1942, and with that, the Red Army more or less ensured a constant influx of new snipers into their ranks, so it's not odd at all to see so many snipers in this movie. Collectively, Red Army snipers had the biggest kill count in the Second World War. There were just so many of them, and they were so good at what they did that they made a huge dent in German lines. Women snipers alone are credited with more than 10,000 kills. Let's move on to one of the 4 biggest aforementioned elephants in the room, the not a step back order.
Those who retreat,
I need a rifle.
will be shot.
I need a rifle.
There will be no mercy for cowards and traitors.
This is something that has been depicted and often exaggerated in dozens of popular movies, but it's not as black and white as some people would have you believe. Known officially as Order Number 227, this order was issued by Stalin on July 28, 1942, only 11 days into the Battle of Stalingrad. By the order, each front had to create 1 to 3 so-called penal battalions, which consisted of middle and high-ranking commanders who were accused of disciplinary problems. These battalions were to be sent to the most dangerous sections on the front lines. This isn't that relevant to us as it's not seen in the movie, but it deserves mentioning because it's part of the order after all. What is important to the movie are the blocking detachments. According to the order, each army had to create block attachments that would shoot cowards and panic mongers. According to Soviet reports, blocking detachments shot around 1,000 soldiers by October 1942, which is when the idea of killing your own men was unofficially abandoned. This is the key part. By the time the movie takes place, which is the fall of 1942, Soviets largely rejected the idea of shooting their own retreating men. Retreating is a key element of military tactics and strategy. It is as basic as bounding. The Soviets weren't idiots. They knew this. What they wanted to avoid was men running from battle and deserting, and they quickly realized that it's more economic to detain these men and send them back into battle in a penal battalion than shoot them. Did it happen in Stalingrad specifically? It is possible that an officer in charge of a blocking detachment ordered the machine gunner to open fire, but that would be that officer's personal choice in that moment more than a general order. So, in short, when blocking attachments did exist, they quickly gave up on shooting their own men and started focusing on detaining them and returning them to battle. This means that even though this scene holds some ground in reality, it's largely unrealistic. Shooting deserters, like the men that jump out the boat and try to swim for it, was much more common. Another elephant that can't be ignored is the 1 rifle, 2 men myth. Early in the movie, we see the Red Army issuing 1 Mosin-Nagant per 2 men. Once the first rifleman dies in battle, the second one should take his rifle and fight. Vasily is actually one of the soldiers who doesn't get a rifle. As historians say, this is hogwash. Soviet firearm production was massive, and it was borderline impossible for anyone to be left without a gun. More than 3 million new Mosin-Nagants were produced in 1942 alone, and about 3,000 PPSH-41s were produced daily in that same year. Given that the Red Army counted no more than 12.5 million soldiers at a time, it's easy to figure out that every single soldier in Stalingrad went into combat well armed. What this moment is based on are the few occurrences in the beginning of Germany's invasion of the USSR. Early into the invasion, specifically near Odessa, the Germans managed to disorient the Soviets and leave them scrambling for guns and ammo, more often than not in attempts to escape incoming waves of Germans. In those isolated instances, it did sometimes happen that 2 men would be left with a single firearm. However, these were isolated, rare occurrences, and they were absolutely never part of Soviet doctrine. Historian Alexei Isayev called this scene pure nonsense. Handing the soldiers just a single 5-round clip is something we also see, and although it's unlikely, it's far likelier to have happened than giving them one rifle for 2 men. There were times during the Battle of Stalingrad when the Red Army was very low on ammo, and this may be the director's way of depicting that. Something else that we see in the movie is the Soviet man charge, in which Soviets send waves of men to mindlessly charge entrenched German positions. This is another myth that's loosely based in reality. While these attacks did happen on a few occasions, they were a result of poor on-the-spot decision-making, not part of Soviet doctrine. This also happened when the Soviets found themselves surrounded by Germans and saw no way out other than running through the wall of fire before them. Soviet officers were actually punished if they lost too many men, and they knew that Germans were equipped well enough to fight off incoming hordes of men, so it's extremely unlikely that an officer would send men into battle with the sole purpose to overwhelm the enemy with bodies. Another moment that needs a reality check is the German propaganda loudspeaker.
Join your German comrades. They understand your suffering and will care more for you than your officers, who are only sending you to your death.
Although it's referenced in many movies and video games, it was usually the other way around. The Soviets were the ones telling the Germans to surrender. Soviets rarely surrendered to Germans because they knew they'd be executed. More than half of all Soviet prisoners of war were killed. One of the few true things, however, is Soviet propaganda. Vasily Zaitsev really was portrayed as a hero in Soviet propaganda, and Soviet command really did boost his image to strike fear in the hearts of German troops and to inspire their own. Because of this, some historians say that his numbers may be exaggerated, but that can't be proven. In the movie, German command sends Major Koenig to dispatch Zaitsev into oblivion and alleviate the pressure on German troops, and this is probably the biggest mistake this movie makes in terms of historical accuracy. In simplest terms possible, nobody can prove that Major Koenig actually existed. There are no verifiable accounts of his existence in German nor Soviet records, and there's no material evidence either. There are also no accounts of Zaitsev ever having a sniper 1v1 with anyone in Stalingrad. In fact, the only person that claimed Koenig was real was Zaitsev himself. In his book, Zaitsev wrote that he and Koenig battled it out over the course of 3 days. It was also reported by Russian press that on a trip to Berlin, Zaitsev was approached by a woman claiming to be the daughter of Major Koenig. Aside from that, there is no mention of Major Koenig's existence in the real world. A lot of historians suspect that Koenig was invented by the Soviets to turn Zaitsev into a god in the eyes of his comrades, and by following that line, they assume Zaitsev talked about Koenig in his book for the same reason. Let's hypothesize that Zaitsev's book is real. If it is, the way the movie depicted the battle between the two snipers is entirely wrong. According to Zaitsev, he killed Koenig by using Kulikov and a fake helmet as bait. Once he saw the helmet, Koenig shot it, and Kulikov shouted to make the German sniper think he killed Zaitsev. And after that, Koenig simply left his hiding spot and walked straight into Vasily's line of fire. Many historians criticize this story, as no Soviet source acknowledges the existence of the documents Zaitsev supposedly took from Koenig's dead body. Zaitsev's sniper notebook is also filled with specific dates and kill lists, but there's no mention of Koenig in it. Finally, Zaitsev says that he killed Koenig in the afternoon, and he figured his position out because the sunlight glinted off his scope. This is odd, according to historian Frank Ellis, as German lines were facing east and the sun sets in the west. If that story is somehow true though, the movie is once again historically wrong. In the movie, Koenig realizes that the helmet is bait, he doesn't bite, and instead kills Kulikov. Part of the principle is the same though, as in the end of the movie, Koenig reveals his position after shooting Commissar Danilov, believing he had shot Vasily instead. Either way, it's entirely possible that Koenig never existed, and that the entire story is made up. This, by the way, is not throwing shade on Vasily Zaitsev in any way. If that story is manufactured, he's a victim of Soviet propaganda just as we are for believing in it. The man still killed hundreds of enemies during the war, but it's possible that the entire plot of this allegedly historically accurate movie is fake. A plot point that might be true, although there's no way confirming, is the use of child spies by the Soviets. In the movie, the Soviets use Sasha to feed false information to Koenig and report back to Vasily. Although there's no official mention of it, the Soviets did have child soldiers. Most of these children were members of the military in a strictly non-combat capacity, unlike Germany's Hitler Youth, and they would only see combat when they reached adulthood, but they nonetheless existed. It's not far-fetched to imagine that they'd use a child to manipulate the enemy. A final historic point we'll take a look at has nothing to do with firearms or military history, but with the love side story which a lot of people hated, but it was actually based in reality. Remember how we said earlier that Tanya Chernova was a real person? Yeah, well, not only was she a real person, she was trained by Zaitsev himself. She had apparently killed 24 men, and during their time together, Tanya and Vasily really did develop a relationship. However, in the movie, Vasily finds Tanya after killing Koenig, which is not what happened in real life. In real life, Chernova was badly wounded in the Battle of Stalingrad, and while she was recovering, she was told that Zaitsev was killed in an explosion. She moved on with her life without him, and he moved on without her, also believing she was dead. Vasily eventually met and married another woman, and Chernova only found out that he was alive in 1969 when she was interviewed by William Craig, the author of the historically controversial novel. It's a pretty sad ending to things when you consider the things they've been through together. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. When it comes to firearm realism, most of the firearms seen in the movie are era accurate and realistically depicted, but there are notable issues with the scopes on both Vasily's and Major Koenig's sniper rifles. Minor firearm issues relate to the MG42 with the vertical charging handle and the TT33 with the wrong serrations. This movie was very close to perfection with the sniper rifles, which are obviously the most important firearms in the movie, but the use of wrong scopes ultimately lands it at a 7 out of 10 for realism. However, it has to be pointed out that this grade is purely technical. The wrong scopes and those other minor mistakes do not in any way break immersion. The biggest sins this movie commits come in the form of historical nonsense. Some things, such as shooting retreating men, Soviet man charges, or the 1 rifle per 2 men rule, are somewhat based in reality, but they're overblown to almost comical levels for a movie claiming to be based on true events. The role of women, especially female snipers, isn't highlighted enough, and the battle between the protagonist and the main antagonist is quite likely a story that was made up to boost morale. Now, keep in mind that nobody here at Shooting Blanks is a historian, but based on all that data, we're forced to rate the historical accuracy of this movie, pertaining mostly to military history, with a pitiful 2 out of 10. The only thing this movie got right is the timeline, the outfits, and the general character and career of Vasily Zaitsev. Aside from that, it's a fun watch, but calling it an accurate depiction of historic events would be an insult to everyone who actually fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. Which movies do you want to see picked apart next? And which other historic movie do you think is actually full of it? Leave your comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe.